Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Welcome, everyone. It's Susan Kaufman. I'm here for Attitude Magazine's weekly ADHD Experts webinar broadcast. Today, we're talking about something really important and something pretty stressful, which is how to advocate for our children. Many of us feel helpless and uninformed about our children's rights, and when it comes to their education or their health care, especially true for parents of children with ADHD, with autism spectrum disorders or learning disabilities. Our kids are often misunderstood at school, and they're stressed by having to work twice as hard as their neurotypical peers with often almost no positive feedback. So advocating effectively for your child is pretty much an essential to address their challenges at school. We're so fortunate today to welcome guest speaker Penny Williams, who will be talking about her experience advocating for her child's rights at school and beyond. And she'll give us strategies and tips based on her experience for things like working with teachers and school administrators, how to take your requests up to the next level and escalate things if you need to, how she advocated for her child in the doctor's office, especially when it came time to pursue co-occurring diagnoses such as sensory processing disorder or autism spectrum disorders. Penny is someone who is a great resource for parents of ADHD kids. She, like many of us, was thrust into this world when her child was diagnosed at age 6, pretty typical. But unlike many of us, she's investigated this to the max, and she has published 3 really wonderful award-winning books about parenting a child with ADHD. One is called Boy Without Instructions, the story of her son. Second is called What to Expect When Parenting Children with ADHD. And her third recent book is called The Insider's Guide to ADHD. She is active helping to guide and mentor parents raising children with ADHD and or autism, offering parent coaching and other services. And you can reach her via her website, parentingadhdandautism.com. In addition to writing books and doing everything else that she does, she writes for Attitude, and we're really fortunate to have her, as well as a number of other special needs publications in parenting. So Penny, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate the invitation. I'm really excited about this. I want to start with just a little bit of an overview about the different areas where we can advocate for our kids. I always think of school whenever I hear the word advocate or advocacy, because I think that's where we advocate the most for our kids. But there are a lot of other areas where we're advocating for them as well, even if we're not quite connecting it as advocacy. Our kids with ADHD and autism and maybe learning disabilities are often very misunderstood. They're misunderstood at school, at home, in our communities, even at the doctor's or the therapist's office sometimes. And when you add to that them already having to work twice as hard as their neurotypical peers, and they're still fully not succeeding even after working that hard, it means a lot of stress on our kids. Their struggle is very real. Ross Greene, one of my favorite authors on ADHD and behavior, says kids do well if they can. So if they're not doing well, it means that there's some barrier that we need to discover and address. There's some area where you need to advocate for them. And really, there's probably many areas where you need to advocate for your child. So we'll talk about school first, because I think that's the biggest for advocacy. We definitely in our house spend most advocating time on trying to improve my son's experiences at school. So I'm going to share some strategies with you particular to school first. Number 1, you need to work with teachers to discover and address problems at school with a collaborative approach. And what I mean when I use the word collaborative is to kind of work together as a team, to both give input and receive input and pull that together into more of a team process. You have to remain calm, and you have to leave your emotions at home. And I know this is easier said than done. I have been through this many, many times. I often want to give a very emotional response, but you really don't get anywhere with that. It just causes people on the other side to shut down. You need to ask the teacher to detail the problems that they're experiencing with your child in the classroom and make sure that they're including the time of day for that list that they give you. And ask them too to tell you about strengths and when your child is doing well, because all of that needs to come together. It's not just about the weaknesses. You're looking at the strengths too in order to come up with strategies to address those weaknesses. The strengths are just as important. So then you're going to work together with the teacher when you come together with these strengths and weaknesses and problem times of the day in order to get to the root of the problem and to create some strategies for success. Number 2 is to remember that behavior is communication. That is not something I learned for quite some time. That's more recent to me in the last couple of years. And I find that to really be kind of a guiding compass. If you're realizing that all of your child's behavior is something that they're really trying to communicate to you and they're just not doing it in an appropriate way because maybe they don't have those skills, it makes it a lot easier then to discover triggers and be able to work on developing some strategies. So when I say behavior is communication, it can be things like avoiding school, which is a huge issue in our house, acting out against peers or teachers, maybe fleeing the classroom or refusing to do their schoolwork, unmotivated to complete schoolwork or unmotivated to do well at school in general. They could be overly emotional. They could be making up stories about things that, quote, happened to them at school. That's a big one for us. My son has told some really tall tales when he comes home from school, and he's really trying to communicate to me what it feels like for him, how anxious and overwhelming it is for him. But he ends up coming in and telling some stories that can get him and I both in trouble. But that's one way that he's trying to communicate. And all of those different examples I gave you could be your child trying to tell you something and really not knowing how to do it properly. So in that instance, we need to work with them to determine the root of the issue. It could be sensory issues, could be that the work is too hard for them, the schoolwork. They might be having social problems. Maybe it's lagging skills like frustration, tolerance, or time blindness. It could be that they're really overwhelmed or they have a fear or anxiety. There's so many different possibilities for why they are acting out. But you just can't solve the behavior issues until you resolve the reason for them. So to give you an example, if your child's having an anger outburst, it could be that they're anxious about something. They have a lot of anxiety or fear about something. It could be lagging skills, again, like frustration tolerance, or emotional control. Refusal to do their work could be that the work's too hard, could be that the environment is too loud or overwhelming. There's just a vast amount of possibilities there, and it's our job as parents to work with the school and to really determine what is going on down to the nitty-gritty in order to make things better and more successful. Because if we don't address what's really at the root of it, we're not going to change the behavior. I mentioned for a second that my son has some serious school avoidance issues. It started in 4th grade when he chased my car through traffic after I dropped him off at school. And it has continued every year. He's about to go into 8th grade in a couple of weeks. And it's a very, very difficult thing to manage because your kids have to go to school. It's a law. And what we figured out over time was that there was a lot of stress and struggling for him. And that's what was leading him to the avoidance, because we weren't addressing the really deep down issues that he was having, like feeling misunderstood by teachers because he's twice exceptional, and it all just got to be too much for him. So he was refusing to go to school because he just didn't feel like he could manage all that stress. And it was really hard for us to look past what that looked like on the surface. On the surface, it looked like he was just being lazy, or he just didn't want to go to school, because kids really don't want to go to school. And he was not successful at forcing himself to do it, even though it was not comfortable for him like most kids would do. So we had to discover why. And what we realized over time is that it was a lot of environmental things, noises, sensory issues. It was social discomfort. It was not feeling understood by teachers having too great of expectations on him. There were a lot of things that really added up and kind of compounded that stress for him to a breaking point. So that school avoidance behavior was him trying to communicate all those problems and struggles that he was having while in the classroom. Another strategy for advocating at school is working with the school staff and the administration, principals, vice principals, school counselors. Work with them collaboratively, because that is the most effective way to advocate for your child. So let's talk about some tips for successful collaboration with teachers and administrators. Number one, ask for their ideas, ask for their input. When we as parents walk into meetings and just start spouting off what we want to see, what we think is best, it really creates that us versus them dynamic from the beginning, and that really is ineffective. It makes the teachers and administrators kind of shut down to what you have to say. You definitely catch more flies with honey. There is a reason that that is a cliche, and that is an approach that really is what you need to create that team collaborative dynamic, being very open and being as kind and honest as you can, again, without putting all of that emotion into it. So again, you've got to keep your emotions out of it. What I found helpful is to vent to my spouse or to friends that I have that kind of understand the special parenthood. I have written nasty rebuttal emails to the school that I'd like to send, but then I don't send it. It's just more of venting for me, a way for me to kind of work through those emotions, because you really have to do that without involving the school staff, because it just makes them shut down. So you want to stick to facts and a matter-of-fact collaborative tone. I know this is difficult, you guys. I've been there. I am a parent like you. I get it. This is super hard to do, and it takes a lot of effort for me in order to keep my emotions out of it, in order to not send that nasty rebuttal email. But I have learned over time that that is just really paramount to be able to get to what my son needs in working with the school. Another strategy for advocating with the school is to present 2 letters to them before you have school meetings. One is a parent concerns letter, and number 2 is a present levels of performance letter. And I actually just learned this last school year from a great special education resource website online. And so what I did before the last IEP meeting last year was I typed up first the parent concerns letter, which was everything that I was concerned about. And I mean everything, not just grades, not just academics. You're including everything about their school experience. And you need to cite references from evaluations as much as you can. So when I did this for my son for our last meeting, I actually copied and pasted from scans of evaluation reports where that evaluator was making suggestions for accommodations in the classroom that then linked to the concerns that I had. That way, I was validating my concerns with expert opinion as well, which only makes it a little more easy for the school to accept. So in the parent concerns letter, I had things like, first, I listed his strengths, because I think that's always very important. You want to start out with the positive, not with the negative. I had things listed like keeping up with his assignments and papers, note-taking and study skills, managing his frustration, time to work more slowly than his peers and others in his classroom, getting quiet breaks to manage anxiety, complex math struggles, need for assistive technology, and preparing for high school and for life, skills that he needs to succeed in high school and succeed in life, because we're going into 8th grade, and now that's a concern. That's almost the here and now. It's very important. And then the present levels of performance letter, you would submit that as well a couple of days before the meeting. And on that, you're going to want to include current grades, the current struggles at school. And again, those struggles at school can include academic, behavior, social, and emotional. It is not just grades. And then include how any existing goals and accommodations have been implemented up to that point in time, and then which have succeeded and which have failed. And I found that really important because our special education teachers and classroom teachers feel like they're doing so much, and they talk about what strategies they've implemented, but they're often not very good about going back and seeing what's worked and what's not worked. So when you push them on the fact that, there's no successful accommodation in the classroom, they're saying, hey, but I did this. I created this organization system for your son, but if it's not working, we need to move on from there and find a new strategy. So that's a really important piece in that present levels of performance letter as well. Again, you're going to want to cite specific incidents and dates as much as possible. And then for both of these letters, you want to make sure that they are copied and pasted word for word into the IEP document. There are sections for both parent concerns and present levels of performance. What I did was send a Word document, a Microsoft Word document, so that they could just very easily copy and paste it right into the IEP. It helped to ensure that it got in there. Another strategy when you're working on a 504 plan or an IEP is to make sure the accommodations and goals spell out what you can expect from whom at the school, as well as what they expect from your child and what they expect from you. This has to be very detailed. If you're reading an accommodation or an IEP goal and you have to make any assumptions when you're reading that IEP goal or that accommodation, it is not specific enough. This is something I learned the hard way this last school year, because when I really sat down and read the goals without any emotion, I realized that the school did think that they were doing what they were supposed to do. And I had interpreted those goals and added my own opinion about what they meant. So in that last IEP meeting, we sat down and made every goal much more specific to address that issue so that everybody knew exactly what was expected from each other. The last strategy that I want to talk about for advocating at school is don't expect perfection. Your child has a disability, might have many like my son, and they are going to struggle some. We can't take that away. We can't erase that no matter how much we want to. The goal for accommodations at school should be to teach lagging skills and to level the playing field so that your child has the same access to success at school that their neurotypical peers have. And that's going to look different for each of our kids. That's why it's an individualized education plan. If you find yourself at an impasse with your child's school, you need to take your concerns to the next level. I've spoken to the director of special ed for our school board on many occasions over the last few years when I felt like I wasn't being heard at the school level, or I was being told information that wasn't even true. Things like that we all have probably heard. I also filed a state complaint with the State Department of Education when I knew that the school was breaking the law, and I just wasn't able to get anywhere with them, no matter how hard I tried. If you can, it would be really helpful to you to hire an advocate if you can afford to do that. I know some states have free advocacy services, so definitely look into that. My understanding is that schools, teachers, and administrators, IEP teams, 504 teams, they really sit up and take note when there's an advocate in the room, that it really is effective. So our next section that we're going to talk about in advocating for our kids is at the doctor's office. This is one a lot of us wouldn't think about as far as advocacy is concerned, but you really do. Every time you go in for a doctor's or a therapy appointment, you're advocating for your child and what they need from that individual. Sometimes our doctor and therapy appointments are rushed, or they don't explore current problems that we're experiencing. So become an informed patient, or in our case, an informed parent of a patient, and use your advocacy skills in that doctor's office too. If you have current struggles that you need help with, bring it up with the physician or the therapist at the very beginning of your appointment. So you might say, today, I want to be sure we talk about X, Y, and Z before our appointment's over and before we leave your office. That's a good way to be sure that that's on their radar and they make time to review those concerns with you. I find it helpful to keep a running list of what I want to discuss with my son's therapist or doctor. I even do the same for myself for the doctor. Then I'm not going to forget anything that I wanted to talk about. I used a list app on my iPhone called Wunderlist. That way, I always have my phone with me. I'm not forgetting some paper list that I wrote somewhere. But you should use whatever works for you. But I encourage you to keep a log of your concerns to take with you to the doctor. That'll help you advocate in those different areas and to remember what you need to discuss. Even better, if you can keep a daily journal of food, sleep, and behavior, take that with you to the doctor or the therapist. That way you can look up patterns and work on specific strategies along where you have been over that time period that you've been journaling. You can look right back and see what you need to be working on. And of course, if you feel like your child's doctor or therapist isn't hearing you, they're not really listening to you, then it's important that you find a new one. If they're not validating your insights or your concerns, then they're not the right doctor or therapist for you, your child, your family. You're on a mission to craft a successful life for your child. Don't let a professional who isn't listening to you keep you from attaining that goal. That's a super important goal. We also advocate for our kids in the community. I don't have to tell you guys that our kids are widely misunderstood in our communities. We often have to manage the inappropriate expectations from our friends' kids, our neighbors, our coaches, our scout leaders, anyone like that, teachers too, as well as part of the community. When your child is spending time with someone in the community, you need to let them know about the weaknesses and your child's struggles that will come up during their time together. So I'm not saying that you share everything, every struggle, say with your child's baseball coach, just the things that they need to know about during their time with your child. So don't tell a baseball coach that your child has dysgraphia or trouble sleeping. This is a need to know sort of suggestion. So for instance, let's say your child's taking swimming lessons. The instructor needs to know that they need to watch your child to be sure they are hearing and understanding and processing instructions during class. That's for safety, if nothing else. They need to know if your child is anxious about water. They need to know if your child is impulsive and might jump in the deep end when they're supposed to be waiting and they're not ready for the deep end yet, which is what my son would have done. They need to know if your child might lose focus 30 minutes into their swim lesson when class is really 45 minutes. Sometimes instructors and coaches, these people just aren't going to be a good fit for kids with ADHD. And if you run into that, I encourage you to look for a different group or class or instructor. Activities should be a good experience for our kids, or else they're just not worth doing. We also advocate for our kids at home. And I know using the word advocate for home sounds really weird because usually we're advocating to other people in our kids' lives, not to ourselves. But it's really important for home time as well. You can advocate for your child during your family life by helping them reduce stress as much as possible. Let's talk about some stress relieving strategies. First, and most importantly, in my opinion, is to be open to hearing your child's truth and to validate their feelings. Let them tell you whatever's on their mind and don't judge them for what they're telling you, even if what they're telling you is out of scale for their age or for the situation. It may not be out of scale for their developmental age, because kids with ADHD are typically 2 to 3 years behind their peers in developmental areas. So my son is 13, but his ADHD and his autism and other disabilities tell me that him having a 10-year-old response might be appropriate for him. And that might be how he's feeling at the time. And that's valid for him. And I have to listen and be open and accepting of that. Another way to advocate for our kids at home and our families is to craft opportunities for them to experience successes and to experience successes often. Those who grow up with ADHD are consistently bombarded with messages that they're not good enough, they're lazy, defiant, or broken. And that adds a lot of stress for them. As parents, we have to show our kids that we are just as deserving and capable of success as anyone else. Our kids are just as deserving and capable of success as anyone else. It's just in their own way. Every success will give them a little bit of relief. You can do this, crafting opportunities for success, by nurturing talents and interests. Offer them to participate in groups and activities where they can succeed as much as possible. If they're into art, sign them up for an art class. If they're into mechanics, maybe there's a kid's electrical course in your town, or maybe you I've known some families who go to Goodwill and they get old computers and televisions and things like that, and they let their kids take them apart and put them back together, or take them apart and reuse the parts to create something, because that's what their child is into, and that's creating an opportunity for success for that child. Another way to advocate at home is to make sure that your child knows that you love them no matter what, unconditionally. It's really hard growing up feeling like you're always letting other people down, and that's a real truth for our kids. Make a plan for fears or anxieties up front to reduce their stress. For instance, my son resists going to fireworks on the 4th of July. He likes fireworks a lot, but he's really stressed out about the loud noise and about the crowds. So we sat down and we made a plan for him to help him enjoy the fireworks with less stress. We go to a neighboring small town to see the fireworks instead of in our city, because it's a lot less crowded. And we also bought him noise-canceling headphones. So he wears those headphones during the show, and it greatly reduces those loud bangs and the loud sounds of the fireworks and the crowds around him too. So now he's not as stressed with this plan that we made for him, and he's able to do the things that he enjoys. Helping your child craft a happy and successful life is advocating for them too. You, the parent, are your child's biggest advocate. Stand behind them, stand in their corner, and support them in all these ways to ensure their success and their happiness. We really are advocating them and advocating for them in all these different facets of their lives. And it's really important to, I think, recognize how important your role is and how you can facilitate that advocacy in a successful way for your kids.
Thanks, Penny. That's terrific. And one thing I just want to say is it's so refreshing that you embrace the notion of advocating for our children, because so many attitude readers feel guilty in some way, or are made to feel guilty, and that they're enabling, or that they're in some way over engaged or whatever. So I think it's just really refreshing just to say point blank that is our job,
that's our
to
job.
advocate. Yeah, and it really isn't something that is accepted. I'm not sure why. It's almost the concept that we're supposed to tough love, or I'm not sure what, but yeah. So I think it's great that you're just point blank saying this is our task to advocate for our children.
Absolutely.
A couple of specific questions. I think everyone was very taken with the idea of the parent concerns level and the present level of performance letters.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, you mentioned that you had found a very helpful website, and can you tell our listeners some of the resources that you found that were really helpful to you as you went down this journey?
Sure. Attitude, of course, was a big one. Those letters I learned from an article on adayinourshoes.com, which is written.
Our shoes, okay.
Mm-hmm, it's written by a special education advocate in the United States, and she writes a lot of great articles. And this one was just a real eye-opener for me, because I communicate a lot of these things via email or conversations with the school, but I was not writing them down in an official format, and I was not citing references and professionals, and my specific concerns and my viewpoint was not as well represented in the IEP document. And that's what these two letters do for you, is they really make it a more official format, but it also, by being sure that it's in the document, you're kind of being heard, so to speak, right there in your child's educational plan.
Right. Seems like a really good idea, because we all know emails can get read or not read or lost or whatever to officially. Can you give some examples? People would love to have some examples about the parent concerns letter, just so that as specific examples of the kinds of concerns you might articulate, or someone might articulate.
Yeah, so my last parent concerns letter, the first thing I include is strengths. And we write a letter to our son's teachers every year as well at the beginning of the school year. It's a little short letter from him, and then it's a little short letter from us that accompanies it. And we always start with his strengths and interests in that letter to teachers. And you want to do the same thing in the parent concerns letter. You don't want to start off by kind of painting a picture of your child as this big ball of weaknesses and problems and struggles. You want to show that they're a capable and interesting kid to start with. So you definitely start that parent concerns letter with strengths and interests. Then some things that we were struggling with at the time, and probably will be in 8th grade too, that was in that letter was keeping up with assignments and papers, knowing what he's supposed to do, being prepared for homework, getting it back to school and getting it turned in, note-taking and study skills. He never once studied for a test in 7th grade. He didn't write down any notes because he has dysgraphia and he has slow processing speed and inattention on top of that. So that was a big concern for me, is that they were giving him notes or facilitating notes for him. So that was in my parent concerns letter. Managing frustration is something that we're still working on with him, and I wanted the school to also be working in the same manner with him on that. So that was part of the letter. Time to work slower. A lot of times teachers would tell him to hurry up, or everybody else is finished, or he also had a lot of anxiety about not getting done in time, so he would really rush through things and do a poor job. That was something that I wanted to bring up and address. getting quiet breaks to manage anxiety. Some of his school refusal is due to getting super anxious and still being in that environment where it's loud and noisy and there's high expectations and people, trying to prod him back into being okay instead of letting him work through his anxiety and calm down himself, which is what works for him, is to be in a quiet place and be left alone until he comes to you and says he's ready, which he will do. He won't sit in the guidance office all day to avoid school. He'll let you know when he's comfortable with going back to class. And that was something that I wanted them to really address. Some other things, complex math. In 7th grade, there's a lot of multi-step math, and that was really hard for him. He was skipping steps and just really struggling with that. And then, like I talked about, preparing for high school and for life, those skills that he needs, like study skills and note-taking skills, or the accommodations he needs if he can't master those skills. So that was what was in the parent concerns letter. And it's anything you're concerned about that has to do with their time at school. It's not just grades. It's not just study skills and performance academically. It's everything else. It's the whole of your child and their experience at school. And then the present levels just was kind of my viewpoint. These are his grades right now. When I did this letter, we had just gotten midterms, so I put his midterms grades in, which were kind of dismal. And I listed what I felt like were his current struggles at school, and that was academic, behavior, social, and emotional, all of those things. And then that's the letter where I wrote down the existing goals and accommodations and what we have done to meet them to that point, and what succeeded and what failed. And I think that's really important to point out. And just in general, that's your perspective. I think a lot of us get the message that, oh, we know you love your child, you're their parent, you love them so much. That's been said to me in meetings before. This way, it's a little more validating for our viewpoint by getting it in writing and getting it in there.
Because it's so specific also. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, at least here in New York City, what we're frequently told is, oh, we're just, overwrought helicopter parents. That's kind of the reaction, which is, of course, a way to dismiss you completely. So that sounds like a really helpful. Are there samples of these letters anywhere that we might find and make available to Attitude readers? They sound so helpful. Maybe I think
she had examples in that article where I got the information from.
DayInOurShoes.com. Okay.
Yes, but I was also thinking that would be a good blog post for me for Attitude next.
That would be great. Yeah. So it's always helpful to people when we give them a sample letter, because it's just hard to know how to start, and how to structure it. So,
and that letter that we have our son write and that we write to his teachers at the beginning of the year, there's a sample on Attitude Magazine. That's where I got it and where I started using it from.
Yeah, and that letter, which I love, was actually written by Ellen Kingsley, the founder of Attitude, who was an amazing person who wrote those sample letters. And we've always, letter to my child's teacher, we've always found those to really help people. And here,
those are super terrific.
She wrote them. So, yeah, sample letters is really helpful. I thought your comment about let's see if I can articulate it, about the IEP goal sounding specific, but then actually in implementation, you realize that different interpretations might be possible of the same written language, and how to make it more specific was incredibly insightful, because we've all had that experience where we see something written down and we think we know what it means, but in fact, it needs to be more specific. Can you give some examples about making the IEP goal more specific?
Yeah, so here's what happened to us, and this is something I just learned in the last couple months of the last school year, is that often I would be saying, you're not implementing his goals, you're not implementing his accommodations, he's still struggling, we know he can do better at school, we've seen him do better in the past, and you're not following the IEP, and I found that the school really felt like they were. So many times they would push back to me and say, yes, we are implementing the goals in this IEP document right here. And I kind of had an epiphany last year when I was really battling with them, feeling like they weren't implementing what he needed. When I sat down and just read the goal, just that one or two sentences, I realized that the way it was written, they probably did think that they had implemented that goal. And so it was a really big aha moment for me to realize that it had to be much more specific. I had added in my own mind my expectations of the teachers and the school to that goal myself, but it was not in the goal. It was not their viewpoint of that goal. So, things like my son has a goal for planning and organization because he has really, really huge deficits in executive functioning. And so the goal read something like adults will support him in an organization plan that works for him. It was a little better worded than that, but off the top of my head, that was the basis of that goal. And so then, his organization isn't working. He's missing assignments. He's not turning things in. He's not doing homework, and he's got D's in half of his classes because of it. So I'm saying to them, you're not implementing his IEP because he's still struggling with this. But for them, they had created an organization plan for him. It just wasn't working. The goal didn't specify that it had to be successful.
Right.
And you think that, well, duh, that's part of the IEP. Of course the goal has to be successful, right? But that's not, we're dealing with schools and a legal document, and it is a very literal interpretation of what's on the page. So you have to put in there that this has to be successful for your, how it has to help them. So an organizational plan that keeps him, so that he is turning in homework 4 out of 5 instances, or an organization plan that he's able to manage himself without the help of other adults. That was another kind of push I had with the school, was they weren't supporting his organization enough for it to be effective. They either had to facilitate that with him, or they had to come up with something that he could do on his own. And that's what I saw. But on paper, we didn't have that kind of specific detail. And so they thought, hey, we created this organization plan for him. He's just choosing not to use it.
So what's interesting about what you just said, it sounds like it's not just do X or Y, but do X or Y with the result that
Yes.
X or Y, right? So not just create a plan, but create a plan such that he successfully turns in his homework 5 out of 6 times. I mean, that was so with an outcome specified. And were they open to that when you went back to amend the IEP to include those kinds of goals?
They were, and partly because I had the parent concerns letter and the present levels of performance that I had presented officially about 3 or 4 days before that meeting. I gave them time to go through it and really see. And I had pulled in, he's had, I think, 6 different evaluations now, some schools, some private, for different things. So I went through all of those evaluation documents.
Wow.
And I took out the suggestions from those professionals that met with the concerns and the lower levels of performance. And I think that was super important because, yes, in our kids' file, they have a copy of every single one of those evaluations. But those teachers are not taking the time, because they probably don't have the time, to sit down and do that kind of detailed analysis. And that was
the evaluation would be 15 pages long, and
15,
specific,
30.
or the specific advice might be buried in it, and so you're basically laying it out for them. That sounds really, really helpful. So really, to have to dig into the weeds and really get down to these are the things that we need to see sounds really helpful. And to have that format, is that an official format? is it
No.
officially in the IEP law?
In the IEP form, there is a section for present levels of performance, and there is a section for parent concerns.
Okay.
And usually in the meeting, they just pull up whatever was already in there from the last IEP meeting, and they ask you if you want to add anything. So for years, our parent concerns was that he would go to college, because that's what they told me was an appropriate thing to put in that spot at the first IEP meeting,
10
right?
years away. Yeah.
Right. That was first grade. So, or third grade, I'm sorry. So it's really important to have much more detailed information in those sections. I think, we really are the experts on our kids. We spend the most time with them. And yes, educators are experts on education and learning, but not necessarily in the special needs area.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't know the intricacies of our kids. And so we really have to be not forceful, but a little bit pushy about making sure that they hear our insights and that they take them into account in order to be able to craft the right environment at school for our kids to be successful there.
Right. And it sounds like the specificity and of the goals and of the experience is really key, because, your parent concern being that your child be able to go to college, I can just imagine where that would go nowhere, right?
Right. That's not applicable to right now. It's starting to become more applicable to us as my son gets older. But, we have a lot more concerns than that. That might be the end goal for education, but the here and now is really important. Like in my son's case with school avoidance, whether or not he's going to go to college, I can't think about today. Today, I just have to get him to school and have him stay at school and not call me and not have to pick him up early. Right. That's what I need to do today. And I hope that he learns something while he's there. And, but you really have to prioritize what's important for your own child
right now.
And that's what the IEP is supposed to be. It's an individualized plan. And so often it really isn't. And that's part of our job, is to really make sure that it is specific to the here and now and specific to our own child's strengths and weaknesses.
The word individualized is the key here, right? Yeah, that's really so interesting. Can you talk a little bit, for the general knowledge of the people listening, about how, because people are asking this, how do you initiate an IEP or a 504, and how, when do these meetings take place? A number of people have said that they've tried to bring this up and been told that, there's no resources for it, or they're just not sure how to proceed at the basic level to get an IEP.
So if your kid is struggling, if your child's struggling at school, the first thing you have to do is submit an official letter requesting evaluation and listing your concerns. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a sample letter on Attitude for that. I'm pretty sure that's what I used 8 years ago, the first time. So it's very important that you do it in writing, because in the law there's a process and there's a timeline. So once you submit that letter, and it would say, for example, I'm writing about Mr. Williams. He needs, I'm concerned about his attention and behavior in the classroom. I'm concerned about his writing. That was a big one because he has dysgraphia. And I would like for him to be evaluated by the school for special services, accommodations, etc. That gets submitted to the principal. And most attorneys or advocates will tell you to mail it with a signature required. In the interest of time, I always emailed and got the receipt and read little emails back, because I just didn't have the patience to wait for the mail, and I wanted to make things better right away. So you're submitting that to the principal for sure. You could CC your child's teachers, which is a good idea so they don't feel left out or like you've gone behind their back. You could CC the head of the Department of Special Ed for your area if you want. If you feel like that's going to be necessary, if you've had conversations and they're already pushing back with you, I would give copies to more people and more higher up people to try to make sure something happens. Once they receive your letter, then they decide whether or not they think that it's necessary to evaluate. And this is something I didn't understand for a long time. I thought if you requested it, they absolutely had to do it. And it's not true, but most of the time they are going to do it. And so what they'll do is they'll send you a form that goes along with the IEP forms that gives them permission to evaluate. So you have to sign that form, send it back, and when they receive that signed form from you, they have, I believe it's 60 days to do the evaluation and to meet with you about the results and the next steps. And then based on the results, they could say, yes, they qualify for an IEP, and you move on in that process. They could say they don't qualify for an IEP, but they qualify for a 504 plan, and you would need to set up a meeting with the 504 committee for your school and draft that 504 plan. Or they could say they don't see anything and they don't think they need any accommodations or an IEP or special services. So that's kind of the first leg of it. If you get that answer that they don't qualify for anything, but you feel really strongly that their school experience is not successful, even if it's just behavioral, maybe they have all A's or maybe they have all good marks in the younger years, but if their behavior is not acceptable in the classroom, that's part of what needs to be addressed through services and accommodations. That makes them a different learner, and they have to be successful in the school environment, not just successful on their tests and report cards. Something I learned from Robert Tudisco, who writes a lot for Attitude on the legal perspective, was that when you're getting pushback because your child has decent grades or good grades.
Yeah, that seems very common, right?
Yeah. So take the school handbook and use that, because the school is not just saying that your child has to have particular grades. They expect certain behavior, certain dress code, all of these things that are in that handbook that are spelled out for families that they expect your child to follow and fall in line with. Well, if they're not able to meet that stuff in the handbook, even though they have decent grades, then they're not meeting expectations at school. And that's a way that you can push a little further with that sort of thing. The problem, and the way I see it, the biggest problem is a lack of knowledge inside our schools, even with our administrators, our principals. They don't understand IDEA. They don't understand the laws. And so they feel like they can say, you have good grades, your kid has good grades, so you don't need all this other stuff, and we really don't have the money for it anyway. And they think they're telling you the truth, but they're not. And I've run into some of that, and I know it happens all over. So that's just another part of our advocacy sometimes is to kind of school them on the things that they really should know. But
yeah, the assumption starting out that they do not fully understand what's involved with IEPs and 504s. So we have very little time remaining, and I want to turn to something that a topic that you talked about that I thought was really, really powerful, and that was at the emotional or home level, personal level, supporting and advocating for our child in terms of hearing them and understanding what they're saying and appreciating them as a person and lowering their stress in that level. I think this is just extraordinarily important. And it breaks my heart to think of the kids who don't have that kind of affirmation.
I know.
Some of the questions on the webinar are from people who perhaps their spouse isn't on board with understanding their child, or another person who says, how do I approach other parents who really just see my child as a bad child? Any I know this is a tough question, but any advice for people in terms of bringing other people in their child environment around to seeing them not as a child who deliberately doesn't do things but can't?
That is a really, really, really tough question. That was really hard. And I am very fortunate in my own family that my husband tries to understand, but also my parents, my son's grandparents, are very open to understanding his behavior on that level as well. So I haven't really experienced that to try to fight my way through it. I think, again, it's a matter of setting expectations. So if it's your spouse, you're giving them that knowledge that they don't necessarily have. One super helpful book, and we talked about Ross Greene early on today, is The Explosive Child. And that is the one book that my husband has read and really came away with a lot of ahas about our son's behavior, about seeing it as much more than just defiance or willfulness or trying to get a rise out of us, because he really gets to the root of explaining the whys behind things. I think one thing that really helped me in that journey for myself was to acknowledge and accept ADHD as a developmental disorder, and it's not typically talked about that way.
Right.
But it's really an important perspective, because if I'm expecting my 13-year-old to do everything like a 13-year-old, I'm always going to be frustrated and stressed out. He's always going to be frustrated and stressed out. Nothing is going to be successful because I'm expecting too much of him, because developmentally he's probably only about 10 in most areas.
For me, too, that was a huge insight, and it comes from Russell Barkley, who just says point blank to parents, reconcile yourself to a better set of expectations. It's, 3 to 5 years as much behind where they might be chronologically. So,
I think it's important, too, for those naysayers in your family or your friends to be sure that your child can be successful in front of them. Have them be able to see your child not always struggling and having bad behavior, and if that's inviting your friend and your friend's kids to an activity that your son or daughter does really well with, then, do that, because what you're trying to do is paint a more appropriate picture of your child for them. They're only seeing the surface, and they are considering it through the lens of not understanding ADHD, of not knowing anything about it. And so what we're trying to do is just change that perspective so that they get a clearer picture of our kids, and then they can craft the right expectations.
Penny, thank you so much. Everyone, I really cannot recommend Penny's writing enough. She does just a wonderful job of making it clear exactly what it's like to parent a child with ADHD, with other sensory integration disorder, with other disabilities, and it's just tremendously reaffirming to read her writing.
Thank you.
Penny, where are your books available? Are they on Amazon? How can people find your books?
The books are on Amazon. They're in some Barnes & Noble stores, and I just discovered this morning they're available on Walmart's website as well.
Great.
So there are a few different places. Usually Amazon. Insider tip, it's usually cheapest on Amazon.
Right. And then Penny also writes a blog for Attitude. Thank you, Penny, for everything that you've done, and you've done an amazing job for your son and for everyone else in terms of articulating what it's like and what can help children. A request to repeat the titles of your books from the listeners.
The first one is Boy Without Instructions, and that is basically kind of a memoir written in the style of a novel about our experience from just before diagnosis up through, I guess, the end of 4th grade, so elementary years. What to expect when parenting children with ADHD is more of a guidebook, because I always wanted to have that when my son was diagnosed. I was like, why isn't anybody telling me what to do? I have to figure this out. And so I decided when I got kind of on the backside of figuring that out to put it in writing. And that's what my online course does too. It's that same structure as the What to Expect book. And then the third book that I put out in January of this year is The Insider's Guide to ADHD. And I actually surveyed and talked with 95 adults who grew up with ADHD and asked them questions like, what was most helpful to you growing up from your parents, from your school, from your community? What was not helpful? What did your teachers or your parents do that really was a detriment to you, even though maybe they thought they were helping? That sort of thing. And that's where I had that aha of discovering and accepting my child's truth, because every message I got from those adults all through that process was understand me, understand my strengths, understand my limits, but don't limit me, and help me grow and help me be successful. And that's just a really important message. It's something that I think we struggle with.
Especially because sometimes getting our children help all that makes them feel in some way defective. That's what I learned. So you have to counter that with saying,
exactly,
just because you need help doesn't mean that there's something terribly wrong with you fundamentally.
Exactly.
Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you, Penny, for being with us today, and have a nice weekend. Bye.
Thanks, Susan.
For more Attitude Podcast and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.